Welcome back to Reddit Aliens, everybody. I'm John. How you doing today? So today we're going to be taking a look at a pretty serious topic, so be warned. What is the worst type of torture to have ever existed? It's not safe for work. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.
Keel hauling. For the uninitiated, it was a severe punishment meted out against sailors where they were thrown overboard and then dragged underneath the ship. The extra nastiness of keel hauling comes from the razor-sharp barnacles on the ship's underside. Combine the fear of drowning with the sensation of being shredded by a giant cheese grater. If I remember Dan Carlin's hardcore history right, there was a defeated king that was forced to watch his children be butchered in front of him and then had his eyes gouged out, then left to live his life, so that the last thing he would ever remember seeing was his children's murdered bodies. That seems pretty harsh. How the ancient Persians would execute the worst offenders. They'd force-feed them milk and honey as they were tied to a boat in the middle of a shallow lake or swamp. The constant dairy would cause awful diarrhea, but the honey and locale of wetlands would attract all kinds of flies and insects. The uncontrollable bowel leakage and onset of infection would be awful as they were exposed to the elements. After days, the offender would become a living nest as the insects would burrow into their flesh and orifices to lay eggs. I once autopsied a little girl who slowly starved and dehydrated while tied up in her family home. They beat her intermittently during this, all over the course of a 2-ish-year period. No real reason, they just felt like it. To die slowly at the hands of the people meant to keep you safe, I can imagine the mental torture. She was old enough to know that she was being betrayed. She was 6 or 7 when it all started, and 8 or 9 when her little body gave out. It's been decades, but I still remember that one. Psychological torture to me is the most terrifying. The idea another person can convince your reality and your perspective are objectively wrong. Over time, you begin to question reality, and then you begin to lose your grasp on reality. You eventually have a break with reality, and possibly you never regain your sanity. That to me is so much more terrifying than any kind of physical abuse.
So this post actually raises an interesting question. Now, we can all imagine the physical torture and envision how absolutely horrible it is. But would the psychological aspect be worse? What do you think?
If it is real, then the brazen bull has to be the worst. If you're roasted or steamed alive inside of a metal vessel, you won't die of smoke inhalation. You'll just literally be slow roasted to death. It will take a long time because the fire will be lit after you're already locked inside, so the temp will come up slowly. Your nerves will feel every second of it because they won't be damaged like they would in fire. Equally as bad as being impaled on a stake by Vlad the Impaler. He apparently had it done in such a way that you would survive the process and die slowly of exposure, shock, sepsis, etc. Skinning alive. If done correctly, victim dies from thirst and not from torture, days of agony. The Judas cradle was a tall, thin stool with a sharp metal pyramid on top. The victim would be stripped and bound with ropes. The victim would then be lowered very slowly onto the device, where the pyramid would then enter the vagina or anus. Any movement by the victim would cause an increasing amount of pain. The torturer would rock the victim, raise and drop them repeatedly onto the device, move the legs, causing the tip of the pyramid to protrude in different ways. Often olive oil would be spread over the pyramid, or brass weights hung from the victim's legs to increase the penetration and pain. 2 options. 1. The brazen bull, also known as the bronze bull, Sicilian bull, or bull of Phalaris, was allegedly a torture and execution device defined in ancient Greece. The bull was said to be hollow and made entirely out of bronze with a door in one side. According to legends, the brazen bull was designed in the form and size of an actual bull and had an acoustic apparatus that converted screams into the sound of a bull. The condemned were locked inside the device and a fire was set under it, heating the metal until the person inside was roasted to death. 2. Scaphism, also known as the boats, is an alleged ancient Persian method of execution mentioned by Plutarch in his Life of Artaxerxes. It ostensibly entailed trapping the victim between two boats, feeding and covering them with milk and honey, and allowing them to fester and be devoured by insects and other vermin over time. Probably the stuff that the toy box killer would do to women, starting with the tape he would play for them after he kidnapped them. From history, brazen bull and flaying is certainly up there. However, in more modern times, the Japanese in World War II used to eat US POWs. They would keep them alive, and many POWs would end up maimed without legs or arms, if not completely killed through this barbaric act. This is just one source, but there are plenty online through a Google search. I think most long-term torture, weeks or months, are the worst. Some kidnappings or abuse. As per standard torture methods for me, it's a cage. They put you in a vertical cage that is sized so you can't stand straight nor sit, and they just leave you there. After a day or so, your muscles are so sore, as after running a marathon, just from having to keep the position. Then you stay in that state for days or weeks, depending how much they feed you or how long they want you to suffer. Oubliettes. Basically a really small, tight stone hole around 3 to 5 meters deep where you could neither sit nor lay down, and the hole was sealed with some iron bars. Oubliette comes from the French word oublier, which means to forget. You were really just thrown into the hole and then left there to die and literally be forgotten. Waterboarding is a very simple yet horrific torture method, and it is brutally effective because it focuses on the primal urge to fight drowning. Shoving stuff under people's fingernails is also pretty horrific. It's a great way to inflict maximum pain for very little effort. However, infection can set in very quickly too. I heard of a torture method that the torturers make you go deaf in one ear, question you, then if you don't tell them the answer, they gouge out an eye, then the other. Then, if you still don't tell them, your last ear is gone, so you're deaf and blind and unable to see or hear what they plan to do to you next, so the pain and suffering is sudden and unexpected. Not a very useful interrogation method, but an absolutely despicable torture method. Probably death by 1,000 cuts, where they cut pieces of you off bit at a time, but the wheel was also pretty horrible. It could potentially take really long to die. That effing machine that has ties on your arms and ankles and then rips them completely off the torso, scariest shit ever. Also, being chained to concrete and thrown in a pool with air just inches away and unable to reach, ugh. The pain of not only knowing that your child was mutilated for life because of your shortcomings, but being presented with the evidence in the form of their severed limbs, it gutted me then and is equally disturbing now, without even being particularly graphic, and apparently the punishment ended up being much worse. If you haven't already read Heart of Darkness and King Leopold's Ghost, I'd recommend picking them up. Obviously, none of that fault was actually on those parents or any perceived shortcomings. It was solely the result of the cruelty of the monsters responsible, but anyone with a child is going to blame themselves, and that sort of psychological torture is unimaginable. Humans are devious. The gibbet was a horrible and simple torture device. It's a one-person cage, just small enough that you can't sit, and built around the victim. Then it was hung from a high spot so everyone can see. The victim would die slowly, in there. Then they were left to rot, so anyone who thought of doing whatever it was they did could see and smell the consequences. Crucifixion was pretty horrible. The ankles and wrists are nailed to wood. If you sag down to relieve the pain on your ankles, your hyperextended arms constrict your lungs so you can't breathe, and the nails in your wrists are holding up your weight. The choice is horrible either way. It would take several days to die this way. The old drawn and quartered is horrible too. Drawn, as in pulled to near your joint's breaking point by 4 horses, then quartered. You're strapped to a table and your intestines are cut out of you, and while still attached, they are grilled on a fire right in front of you. This goes on until you bleed out. The Vikings had a few, including the blood eagle. You'd be tied to a rock or tree, then your ribs would be chopped out from the back, and your lungs pulled out so they laid on your shoulders like wings. Some of the things the Imperial Japanese came up with in World War II are truly horrifying.
Imagining someone going through any of these tortures is just horrible and heartbreaking. But think about the people who came up with these torture types. Sadists? Mad people? Terrible.
The forced sterilization experiments done at Auschwitz, where they'd open up the abdomen, cut into the uterus, and place neoplastic cells, basically tumors, into them, which had no effect, surprisingly. Or where 15 girls aged 17 to 18 were placed in an ultra-short wave field and had an electrode placed on their abdomen and vulva, in which they would focus the rays on the ovaries until they were fried. This often caused serious burns, stomach and vulva, due to high doses of which one died directly from the burns. Other experiments included injecting what was assumed to be barium, described as white and cement-like, into the womb from the vagina, allowing them to swell like their stomachs were going to burst before letting them release the fluid with pains compared to that of child labor, and that, of course, they were filled up again. They also made sagittal and transverse sections of the ovaries, causing extreme hormonal changes, causing the young women to become like old women. Many would die of sepsis. I'm not 100% sure of this, but I do remember seeing someone somewhere that claimed that certain castles have a pit not that far from dining hall. A person could be lowered or forced into said pit, which is so small that person can't really sit in it, but the entry is tilted, so the person can't really stand either. Also, it's still steep and narrow enough that person cannot climb out of it. Said pit is located relatively near a kitchen or dining area, so the smell of food and delicacies will reach said pit. On some occasions, there is rudimentary sewer systems running at the bottom of said pit, too small or awkward of an angle that person could not possibly escape that way, without breaking both the person's legs and spine. But person could be standing in running water and potentially in human excrement. Person who goes in will be left to die, or person might be given some food scraps and water to prolong his death. I once came across this video of ISIS militants who locked up 5 men in a cage and slowly lowered the cage into a swimming pool using a crane. The cage remained submerged in the water for about 10 minutes, then it was hauled back up with all the men dead, foaming from the mouth and muscles involuntarily twitching. The thought of them fighting for their lives whilst submerged, knowing well they won't make it out alive, is just insane. Whatever you want to call what Vlad the Impaler did, he shoved a stake up people's assholes and did it in a way where it pushed the organs around and the stake went up the mouth, and since the organs were pushed around, it didn't kill the victim immediately. They had to chill in the pain and misery for hours or even days until they died of internal bleeding. No question, crucifixion. I did research for a book I'm writing. The word excruciating is derived from crucifixion. Some doctors did a medical breakdown of exactly what the process entails. The spikes go through the medial nerve of the wrist, not the palms. Shoulders and elbows dislocate, and the only way to exhale is to lift up your own weight against the spike driven through the metatarsal space in your feet. As a matter of fact, it can go on for so long, the guards tire of watching you suffer. They kill you by breaking your legs so you cannot lift your body anymore and suffocate. Locked in a room with a 15-minute video on repeat with the volume up about 20% too loud for the room, lights never turn off. It's the worst because it doesn't seem like torture until you've been there for 36 hours and you start absent-mindedly repeating the video narration in time to the video.
Now, hearing this one on its face sounds like it pales in comparison to anything else mentioned. But think about it. Imagine that.
Any psychological torture, sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, and waterboarding are way worse than any physical torture. Eventually, the physical torture needs to stop so they don't kill you. Psychological torture can go on forever. Honestly, I don't want to think about it, as it's depressing what humans are willing to do to each other for any given reason. Anything that takes free will from someone is horrific. Slowly cutting off body parts, making the victim more reliant on the torturer, knowing that life can never be the same again, it is one of my worst fears. One of the more effed up things I've read on the internet a long time ago was about a guy who would kidnap young girls, remove their teeth, cut off limbs at the elbow and knee, install eye screws into the nubs with a constant drip of meds to sustain them, and then sell these girls to other people as expirable sex dolls. The eye screws were for stringing the girls up like a sex swing. They could be fiction, but the fact that it could happen is sadness incarnate. Probably the worst form of torture is the one a person is currently experiencing, at least from their perspective it would be. But the one that makes me have a physical response is being impaled, like Vlad the Impaler was so fond of. To think of having a big pointed wooden post pushed in your rectum and out of your mouth in such a way that you could remain alive upright on that thing for several days before you get to die is just terrifying. And people today think current humanity is so terrible. History makes us look positively advanced in comparison. Just think of the breast ripper for another shocking example of past depravities. That one wasn't even designed to kill, just caused incredible pain and lifelong maiming and scarring if they didn't go ahead and kill her anyway after ripping her breasts apart. Absolutely ghoulish what people thought up of ways to hurt each other makes getting shot sound pleasant by comparison. James Marion Sims is known as the father of gynecology. He achieved that title by experimenting with enslaved black women's bodies without anesthesia to perfect his techniques. The first person he experimented on was Lucy, who was 18 years old at the time. She had given birth and, as a result, had bladder incontinence. He shoved a sponge up her urethra, which led to her contracting blood poisoning. He wrote that Lucy's agony was extreme, and I thought she was going to die, but still believed that black people experienced less pain than white people and could handle whatever surgeries he threw at her. Because of his racism, he thought black people were less intelligent because their skulls grew too quickly around their brain. Based off that belief, he would operate on black children using a shoemaker's tool to pry the bones apart and loosen their skull. A statue of him was built, but they eventually took it down in 2018 because of his methods that were controversial, even for the time period he grew up in. While he made significant advancements in women's health, the nature of his surgeries are still felt today in the race gap in the medical community. I've read a lot of dark stuff, but the subject of cartel torture messes me up the most. Commonplace tactics include hooking victims up to IVs to feed them adrenaline, or possibly even meth and other substances. On top of having legs broken and other vile acts committed upon them, the victims are also unable to pass out and kept alive for longer than they would be otherwise. Looking into cartel activity is, for me, the most terrifying contemporary subject out there. I've exposed myself to information that I truly wish I hadn't, and I recommend people be cautious before they inquire too much. It's truly that bad. I've been to the Torture Museum in a place called Alton, Illinois. And, by the way, most of the stuff there had been invented and used by the Catholic Church. The one that stuck out the most to me was they hang your body upside down with both legs spread, then take a giant saw, one person on either end, and just saw you in half, starting between your legs. There was also this contraption to put on somebody's chest with a bunch of rats in it. They light a fire on top of it, and the rats eat through the person's chest cavity to escape.